This morning I want to ask a couple questions before we dive into the passage. Where is your life headed right now? If you were to just take a look and see, where are you going? What's happening? What direction are you going? What drives your decisions? Is it comfort, entertainment, or is it calling? Is it purpose? If the Holy Spirit led you towards suffering, would you follow? If standing with Jesus cost you your livelihood, everything you had, would you stand with him? These are not theoretical questions. In Acts 20, 36 through 21, 16, Paul is headed to Jerusalem. Chains await him. Friends plead with him, but Paul still goes. Not because he's reckless, but because he's surrendered. This passage isn't just about Paul, though. It's about how we follow Jesus when the road ahead is costly and confusing. So this morning, if you have, there is a notes. If you don't have it, there's the back table. Kind of follow along. But this main idea of this passage we're looking at is the Spirit-empowered life embraces gospel friendships, gospel courage, and gospel obedience, even when it's costly, misunderstood, or lonely. So once again, the Spirit-empowered life embraces gospel friendships, gospel courage, gospel obedience, even when it's costly, misunderstood, or lonely. So this morning we're going to be walking with Paul toward Jerusalem. And here's what we're going to see. In the first part, the end of Acts 20, we're going to see tears at departure, the gift and need for gospel friendships. Then in the first 14 verses, the biggest chunk this morning will be warnings on the road, following the Spirit even when others don't understand. And then the last part, resolve with community, walking the hard road with gospel companions, 15 and 16. So this morning, let's walk through this text together and let it shape how we follow Christ, even when the road ahead is hard. So let's begin where Paul's journey takes a tender and tearful turn. In a moment of deep prayer and goodbye with the Ephesian elders. So look with me at verse 36 of chapter 20. And when he had said these things, he knelt down, and he prayed with them all. And there was much weeping on the part of all. They embraced Paul and kissed him, being sorrowful most of all because of the word he had spoken, that they would not see his face again. And then they accompanied him to the ship. See, in Paul's day, public weeping by men, especially by leaders, was not only rare but discouraged and not seen as strength or value. But here, the love runs deep in this relationship. We touched on this a couple weeks ago. Gospel friendships are not shallow. They're forged through prayer, through tears, through shared mission and the Spirit. And we've seen how Paul spent years serving and investing in these Ephesian elders. But I want to give you a little foundation to this partnership and friendship. Even in Eden, in perfection, God said this in Genesis 2:18. It is not good for man to be alone. Now, this was not romantic love alone. This was about companionship. We were made for community. See, friendship is not a result of the fall. Isolation is. See, Paul's ministry proves this. From Antioch to Corinth, he greets, he weeps, he prays, he stays, and he travels with gospel friends. His letters overflow with names and affection. Whether you're looking at Romans 16, Colossians 4, or Philippians 1, over and over you see him mentioning names and talking about people and companions and houses and locations he stays with. We even see in John 13:1 that Jesus loved his own, even to the end. He speaks of this affection. In Romans 12:10 it says, love one another with brotherly affection. This idea of companionship and affection for our brothers and sisters in Christ is deeply rooted in who we are and how we're made. Tim Keller writes it this way: you don't really understand Christianity until you understand that the church isn't a place you go, but a people you belong to. See, Paul's final prayer and tears with these elders, it mirrors what Jesus in his relational investment with the disciples. Think about their time together and their pleading with him. See, the gospel creates lasting bonds and relationships. It unites us in a way that we wouldn't otherwise see. See, the gospel doesn't just save individuals, it creates a new family. Do you have that kind of spiritual family, community? Biblical friendships are not optional, they're essential in the Christian community. So who weeps with you? Who speaks truth to you? Are you investing in spirit-shaped relationships? Do you have gospel friendships where prayer, honesty, and love thrive? Who can you weep and walk with? Who is it that when everything falls apart, that brother or that sister you're able to go to and weep with, to laugh with, to pray with, to be honest and open and transparent with? Kids, who at church do you love? Will you pray for them this week? When you think of those you love, kids, somebody that you know and you love in this church, will you pray for them? See, as Paul leaves his friends behind, the road doesn't get easier. He's just had this tearful engagement because they're sad that they won't see his face again. But it gets harder, not because of the danger ahead, but because the people who love him the most are about to beg him not to go. See, now we're going to move on to the warnings on the road. And when following the Spirit, even when others don't understand, we're going to look at this passage that can lead to some confusion, but we're going to see here and spend some time here. See, as Paul continues his journey toward Jerusalem, we read in Acts 21 that of the repeated warnings, but they're not from enemies, but from fellow brothers and sisters, believers. Paul recounts, reminder, he's the one writing this, how Paul and his companions sailed to Miletus and to Kos, and then to Rhodes, and then from there to Patara. And after finding a ship crossing to Phoenicia, they passed Cyprus and eventually landed at Tyre, when they stayed with the disciples for 7 days. Now it says these believers, moved by the Spirit, urged Paul not to go to Jerusalem. Have you ever followed God's guidance and been ridiculed or been told it's foolish, it doesn't make sense by those closest to you? Have you ever pursued something that you thought you were confident that God, the Lord, was leading you, but those around you gave you all the warnings and things that was not to go? And in good jest, these were not people who were trying to upheave him. They were not people who didn't love him. These were people who loved him. Well, I can tell you a story for myself. When I first felt called to go to seminary and ministry, there was lots of questions about, is this a thing to do? Is this just a fade? What's taking place here? And I wasn't sure. There was lots of questions and concerns. Even my wife was hesitant to what is this about? I don't know if you're mature enough for that. I don't know if you're at that place where you've grown enough. And the reality is I wasn't. I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't prepared in those ways. But God put an inkling, and there was a battle back and forth. And eventually, we made the decision to move and go to seminary, even though there were so many cautions. And of course, all of my secular and people who are good friends who I worked with, back then I worked in the corporate world and was making a decent living. And those people just didn't understand why I would leave money and this stuff to go. It didn't make any sense to them. Even fellow Christians I knew didn't think it made sense to move my whole family and go somewhere else that I didn't know what the future held. And even those closest, like my wife, was questioning whether or not I was ready for these things. And the reality is I wasn't, and sometimes we're not, as we'll see in the story. But if God is calling you in that way, yes, you want to test it, you want to listen to wise counsel, but you have to also eventually make the call. I'm going to follow God's call regardless of what others say. And today's story is going to illuminate that reality. And so I did go to seminary, and I did move my family to Wake Forest and spent 5 years there. And we didn't know how we were going to pay bills or take care of life. But God provided. See, when their time had ended in this place, they spent 7 days here. It says they departed, but what happened? They joined by the believers and their families who accompanied them to the shore. If we look and see the picture here, it says, and after having sought out, this is verse 4, the disciples, we stayed there for 7 days, and through the Spirit they were telling Paul not to go to Jerusalem. When our days there were ended, we departed and went on our journey, and they all, with wives and children, accompanied us until we were outside the city. And kneeling down on the beach, we prayed and said farewell to one another, and then we went aboard the ship, and they returned home. So once again, we see this picture where Paul and this community, they're coming together, and they're praying and sending him off. There's this beautiful picture of families. I mean, it says the husbands and the wives and the children, they all come out and they go down and they kneel down and they pray with them and wait for them to leave. They send them on their way. From Tyre, Paul traveled then to Ptolemais and then to Caesarea, staying in the home of Philip the evangelist. And it says here he's one of the 7. Do you guys remember who Philip is? So he's one of the 7 deacons who were identified and sent to serve the widows of the Gentiles. Stephen, one of them, who was the one who would lay down his life. Philip was the one who was carried away and preached to the eunuch and then baptized him in the water. And then he carried away and went to Caesarea. And then he stayed there. That's where it's at. And here he's now been there a while. It's been now 20 plus years. And now has 4 daughters who are unmarried, who are prophetess, they say here. Now it doesn't actually speak about what they spoke on or what truth they shared, but it does. Instead it says here we're joined by Agabus, a prophet from Judea. Now in this prophet who comes in a vivid poetic act, similar to Jeremiah and Ezekiel if you follow the Old Testament, what does he do? He bound his hands and feet with Paul's belt, declaring, "This is how the Jews at Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." So upon hearing this, what happens? Everyone present, including Luke, because it says we, and he's the one writing this, we begged Paul not to go. So now they have a prophet who comes here and tells them what is going to take place when he goes into Jerusalem. But what does Paul answer and says in verse 13? He says, "What are you doing? Weeping and breaking my heart, for I am ready not only to be imprisoned, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." And when it came clear he would not be persuaded, they surrendered their appeals, saying, "Let the will of the Lord be done." See, Paul is repeatedly warned, not by enemies, but by loving friends. Their prophetic insight is genuine and even spirit-given, as it tells us here. But their interpretation that Paul should not go is based on fear, not faith. This isn't a contradiction, it's a complexity. The Spirit reveals what will happen, not that Paul should avoid it. He knows he's going into danger. You remember back in Acts 19:21, it says this, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in his spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem." And later in Acts 20:22 and 23, Paul tells the Ephesian elders, "And now behold, I am going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies that imprisonment and afflictions await me." So he had already been, in this case, resolved in his spirit and his heart. God had already guided him, told him this is where you're going, and you will suffer. So even though they're telling him this stuff, he's aware of it. He knows that he's going to suffer. So when Agabus prophesied about Paul's arrest, it's not a call to retreat. It's a glimpse into what obedience will cost him. See, one commentator, John Stout, says this, "There is no inconsistency between the Spirit's warning and Paul's decision to proceed. The former was a prediction, not a prohibition, not a prevention, but instead it's just identifying this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to take place. You are going to suffer in here." But Paul understands this. See, the Spirit reveals hardship is ahead, and Paul still walks forward. The disciples' plea not to go come from love. These people love him. I don't want you to get it wrong. These are people who care for him. They're holding him in their house. They're weeping because they're not going to see his face. These people love him. But it's not a Spirit's command. Paul, like Jesus, resolved to obey God's will, even when his friends could not understand it. Maybe you know people who have gone into places you don't understand, or situations you may not understand, and it looks like you can just see all the flags. Now, this does not mean that there are not situations where you want to plead with somebody and they're going into something that is dark or into something that they shouldn't, or decisions they're making and you want to plead with them. But we have to trust the Lord and know in the end that God's in control. And we see this in their posture and Paul's posture when they say here, it reminisces what we see in Gethsemane with Jesus. But he says, "Let the will of the Lord be done." This is not resignation, it's surrender. See, Paul knew what was ahead. He knew the suffering, imprisonment, and possible death. But yet he walked forward, not because he loved suffering, not because he wanted to be elevated or celebrated, but because he loved Jesus. But Paul's journey is not unique. See, the Lord has shown believers what is still to come, where obedience may lead to suffering or even death for his name. See, in Revelation 13:10, it tells us this, "If anyone is to be taken captive to captivity, he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain." Here is a call for the endurance and the faith of the saints. This is a forecast for us in the future. See, sometimes God counts his servants worthy to suffer, even die for Christ's glory. We see this in Acts 5. Stephen, that he was counted worthy to suffer and die proclaiming the word to the Pharisees, to those listening. This isn't defeat, it's discipleship, it's faithfulness on display. See, the road of obedience is often paved with hardship, but it's also filled with eternal hope in the presence of Christ. even as we see the things that took place here in the early church and what we will look to see in the future where suffering will come. Even when we look around the world and we see suffering happens, we shouldn't be surprised. Like Paul, we may be called to walk a hard road, fully aware of what it may cost us, yet with a heart that says, let the will of the Lord be done. That's what he calls us to. If you remember Isaiah 57, it prophesies, it talks about, I have set my face like a flint. And then Philippians 1:29, it tells us, it has been granted to you to suffer for his sake. See, it's supposed to be a privilege in identifying, and you see this when people count it all joy when they're beaten. How many times have we seen Paul or Peter or these people and Silas being beaten or being ridiculed, and they're singing songs in jail and they're celebrating because they're suffering for Christ? It's supposed to be an honor, although we don't see it that way. And sometimes even for our friends, because we love them, we don't want them to suffer either. Now, Luke draws these intentional parallels between Paul and Jesus in this situation. If you guys remember in Luke 9:51, it says, what did Jesus do? He set his face to go to Jerusalem. He was resolved that knowing and going that he was going to be beaten, imprisoned, and crucified. And what happens in Matthew 16:22 and 23? One of his beloved, his most chief apostle, what does he do? He pleads and he begs for him not to suffer. But what does Jesus do? He rebukes him. Get behind me, Satan. Because suffering was his call. And what does Jesus do in the garden? He pleads, God, if there's any way for this sin, this separation from you, if this suffering, if I can not take it, please let there be. But if not my will, but yours be done. Because suffering is a reality. If you follow Christ, you will suffer in some way. And sometimes those around you will not understand. But that's okay. See, Paul follows that same pattern. He was Spirit-led. He was misunderstood, but resolved to serve for the glory of God. Augustine says this. He says, sometimes to obey God means to grieve those who love us. But true love desires obedience to God above all. Sometimes when we're doing something, others won't understand it. They'll get lost or frustrated. And hey, kids, I know this is a little heavy, but you guys have probably heard, at least if you haven't seen it, the Avengers. Endgame, in one of the movies, they talk about this. And Tony Stark is begged by his friends to stay back and not to go because they figure out the only way possibly they can change things back from destroying and killing half of humanity, or a third, I can't remember what it is. But he goes and he decides to sacrifice. Even though this is a fictitious story, it mirrors the tension of love and calling, that he's understanding that if I do this and I sacrifice myself, all these people will be protected and saved. But Paul's decision, and yours and mine, is much greater than some Avengers movie. It's not cinematic, but Spirit-powered obedience. And those of you kids, especially those who have recently been baptized and chose to say, I want to follow Jesus in obedience, this is a picture of you embracing that reality that when is he going to call you to do something that's hard? When you're going to stand for something that matters. Have you guys ever heard of Jim Elliot? See, Jim Elliot was a missionary who went to Ecuador. He faced similar pleadings when he was going to this place that no one had been. They had a great desire for him. His friends and family thought it was, don't go there. You're going to suffer. These are primitive people. And Jim Elliot is famously quoted for saying this: he is a fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Excuse me, he is no fool. That's a big important distinction. Let me reread that because that does not make any sense there. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Now, if you know the story of him, he flies in to go here to reach these people and was killed by the people he came to teach. So his missionary journey was very short. He trained for it. He went there and was killed almost upon arrival. But yet upon his death, the gospel advances and the hearts were transformed. In fact, his wife is the one who goes and shares the gospel of hope with the people who killed him. And clearly no one understood it. And all the people who warned him felt, I'm sure, justified when he died. And saying, I can't believe he didn't listen. I had the counsel. I was telling him the truth. But sometimes faithful obedience means walking into storms with our eyes wide open. God may show us the fire and still call us to walk through it. Loving friends may plead with us to stay safe, but the call of Christ is not to safety, it's to faithfulness. And there is no safer place to be than where God has called you, even if it's the hardest place you've ever been in your life. See, as we look at this passage and we think about it, we're called to love people deeply, but to love Jesus more. To value wise counsel, but obey God's voice, even if it's misunderstood. If you walk the hard road with Jesus, you may feel alone, but you are never alone. See, following Jesus is costly, but not following Jesus is significantly more costly. Mark 8:36 says, "For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?" See, following Jesus now, you'll experience the greatest eternal joy ever. Rejecting Jesus now, you'll experience the greatest suffering later. So a question for you: can the Spirit entrust to you things you will suffer for the Lord and still anticipate your resolved obedience? Can the Spirit entrust things to you that you will suffer for the Lord and still anticipate that you will be resolved to obey Him? Are you following God's voice above the voices of others? What voice is the loudest in your ear? Who is your chief counsel, the person you listen to? Hey kids, have you ever chosen to stand with Jesus even though you know others might make fun of you for what you're choosing to do is right and honoring God? Have you ever done that, kids? See, but Paul doesn't walk into hardship alone. God surrounds him with gospel companions. It's a reminder that even when the road is narrow, we're meant to walk it together, not alone. Looking at 3, resolve with community. That is walking the hard road with gospel companions. Look with me at verse 15. After these days, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem, and some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Mattern of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge. So we see here some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us. So Paul wasn't alone. God gave him faithful friends to walk with him, just like Jesus had Simon carry his cross, like he had others who were there waiting with him. Yes, some scattered, but he still had companions. See, even when Paul was resolved to go alone, God surrounded him with others. See, gospel mission is rarely solo, it's communal. We've seen this as he addresses elders, he addresses the church community, that the bride of Christ is not just one of us, it is the church. Hebrews 10 reminds us, 24 through 25, we're to stir one another up and to spend time together, meeting together in fellowship. Even when we look at the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes reminds us that 2 are better than 1. That there's this thing that we can help each other up when we fall. When things are together, there's strength in numbers. There's a reality that we're made to be in community. One commentator says, the Christian mission is not a solo act. It's a symphony of shared suffering and strength. The reality is we will suffer things, but we will do it together. I was talking with Derek about their recent camping trip, and the reality is some of the things they went through that were lacking the desire actually served to be a memory. See, the Bass Boys, you will never forget that trip, even if it had trials and you had to carry things and floats through woods and through swamp and through bugs. You won't forget it because when you go through something together, whether it's just a frustration in weather and situation or it's true suffering, it brings strength, it brings community, and you don't forget those things. When you struggle to pay bills, when you struggle to make ends meet, and people come alongside you and they pray for you and then you move through it, it strengthens your relationship, it strengthens your dependence on Christ, it strengthens who you are. There's a cartoon called Inside Out, and they have these different feelings that are all across this thing. It's kind of a bizarre story, but in one of them, it shows the importance of joy and sadness being partnered together. They're kind of fighting, but they eventually learn that the two kind of come together, that you're going to experience sadness and come through joy, and they're not alone, but they come together. They grow. Well, the gospel mission is united by Christ. We're going to experience great joy in trusting in Him, but we're also going to experience suffering and sadness. But that isn't the end of the story. We don't go to those things without hope. Another missionary, David Livingstone, once said, I am prepared to go anywhere provided it be forward. But he never went alone. God always gave him companions for the road, even in Africa's darkest nights. Even in the most difficult places, God continued to provide and care for him. Who is walking with you toward Jesus? Who are you encouraging along the way? So you may feel alone on the hard road, but God walks with you, and He sends people to walk beside you. Don't walk alone. Invite others in. Let them know what's going on. Be someone's companion on the road to obedience. See, if you follow Jesus down the hard road, you're never alone. Walk with others and invite them to know what you're going through. Invite them into the struggle you're dealing with. See, adults, who knows your fears, your spiritual struggles, and helps you keep walking toward Christ? See, who encourages your faith when you feel weary and misunderstood? Who challenges you? Kids, who helps you love and follow Jesus? Kids, who do you want beside you when things are hard? So what do we do with all this? How do we move and walk forward like Paul? See, when we face loss or tears or warnings or confusion, what do? Well, we're challenged here to live like Paul and love like Jesus. See, this passage leaves us with real truth and personal challenges. You and I, we need deep gospel friendships, not shallow Sunday smiles. Are you building Spirit-led, gospel-centered friendships? We must listen to wise counsel, but follow the Spirit's call, even when we're misunderstood. See, are you following God's call, even when friends don't understand? We will face hardship, but we'll never regret obeying Christ. You may walk into pain, you may walk into the fire, but you don't walk alone. Kids, if you remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they stand up and say, "We will not bow down to this." And they go into the furnace. It's heated up so hot that the people who put them in can't even stand. They're burned away. And then they look in and say, "Didn't we not send in 3? But it looks like there is a 4th. And he's shining like a son of the gods." See, even when you're walking into fire, even when you're called and you know where you're going or what's happening, the situation is fraught with challenges and difficulty, you're not alone. Are you walking with others in gospel mission? See, often obedience will sometimes feel foolish to the world or to even our friends, the closest ones. See, following Christ may cost you dearly on this earth, but it's worth any temporary thing you may lose because He's worthy of everything we have. See, like Paul, may we say with confidence and surrender, may we pause all the things and say, "Let the will of the Lord be done in my life." Can we say that? See, it's not an easy path, but it's a Spirit-filled, Christ-centered, eternally rewarding path that leads with us in the presence of Jesus. All the other things will fall away, but He'll still remain. See, Jesus sees you and He knows you. He knows what you're facing. He knows the frustrations you have, whether they're just things with your siblings or whether or not they're heavy things with your relationship or your work or your heart or not knowing what the future holds. God doesn't miss anything. And kids, this doesn't mean you're free to go out because you feel the call to run out and jump and do something crazy. No, you still need to go and talk with your friends and your parents. You need to be challenged with what's going on and make sure, is this of God or is this of me? Is this purpose, is this intent, this calling, this feeling, is it serving my purpose or is it serving His? And even we talked about kids in baptism, when you're calling this, you're inviting all of us, you're inviting all of us to speak truth into your life and you to speak truth into us. If you see us falling off the course, you see something happening, you can speak to that. But in the end, we must remember that it's God is in control. And so as we close, I want you to join with me in praying and asking God to help us because it's not easy. It wasn't easy for Paul to leave these people who are praying. He says, "Why are you ripping my heart in terror?" He's like, he loves these people, and they're asking him as doing something that he potentially would want to do. I mean, think about it, kids. Would you want to stay in a place that they would feed you and house you and love you and celebrate who you are? Or do you want to walk down the street where you might get beaten and imprisoned and possibly put to death to share a message of hope with people who need to hear it. Because eventually Paul is going to go all the way up to the emperor to share with the most ungodly man in the kingdom. Because that was his calling. What are you called to? Will we be able to say, let the will of the Lord be done, no matter what? May it be so. Let's pray.